Hey everybody, welcome. I'm glad everyone made it here. My name is Max Patillo. I'm a sophomore and a member of the lecture fund. And I'd just like to quickly say my thanks to Professor Piridu, to the Humanities Initiative for allowing us to use this incredible space. And I want to say thank you to my colleagues and my friends in the lecture fund. Thank you for all your support and your guidance and helping put this event together. It means the world. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our lovely speakers for this evening. Over here we have Professor Roger Lancaster, Professor Anthropology, and is the Director of Cultural Studies at the University of George Mason. He's the author of numerous works published in the Washington Post, New York Times, and Jacobin, as well as the author of books including The Struggle to be Gay in Mexico, for example, Sex Panic in the Punitive State, and The Trouble with Nature, Sex and Science in Popular Culture. Up front tonight, we have Professor Catherine Liu, Professor of Film and Media Studies at UC Irvine. She's the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, and The American Ideal, Academic Anti-Elitism as Cultural Critique. She's also she also has incredible podcast appearances on Doom Scroll, Jacobin, and pretty recently Midwestern Marks, who I really love. Professor Liu's work centers around the professional managerial class and their dominance over the American left in mass culture. Considering the political situation we're in today, as we're all aware, her critiques, in some ways, unfortunately, have been proven very correct. And while her critiques have been very poignant, I find that her answers to these problems are as well. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all the incredible work you've done. With that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max, for having me, and thanks for all of you coming out today on such a cold afternoon. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, I hope not more than that, and then Roger Lancaster is going to pose some questions to me. I will respond to him, and then I hope we'll open it up to the floor and take questions from the audience. So this is from chapter 2 of the book that I'm going to be publishing with Verso called, for now, Traumatized. It doesn't have a subtitle, so I'm open to suggestions. The chapter 2 is called The Political Gets Personal, Trauma Culture and PMC Feminism. And I'll really be talking about the evolution of what was called social feminism, or because by the 50s, you all know that the McCarthy era made people, and especially people in the center, terrified of socialism or communism. So the women who were working in the 30s and 40s in unions identified themselves as social feminists, and they were quickly eclipsed during the women's movement by the rise of second wave feminists. And this is part of my thesis, and it will owe something to Roger's work as well, is about how trauma culture and the position of the survivor presents a kind of class integration into professional managerial class therapeutics for the mission of second wave feminists. So without further ado, in the 1970s, feminism was taken over by professional women hoping to level playing fields, raise awareness, and highlight the injustices baked into men's unfair advantages in the competition for top jobs in large and prestigious organizations. I argue that second-wave feminism set a trajectory towards the C-suite by way of trauma culture. Highly credentialed women took over the women's movement and steered feminism towards professional life on the one hand and emotional life on the other. Affective, emotional, personal feelings of discontent would henceforth drive the movement and its priorities forward. New left feminists did achieve a great deal for women in general, but they achieved the most for women of the professional managerial class. Powerful women's organizations like Planned Parenthood became fundraising juggernauts by framing patriarchy as the greatest obstacle to injustice for women. I have this. This is actually a Time magazine cover from 1970 featuring Gloria Steinem. In the past 5 decades, white-collar feminism has been relentless in its emphasis on choice when framing arguments over women's control over their bodies and reproductive lives. Choice, of course, is a value that comes from consumerism and its discontents, but it's also amply used by neoliberals to frame the fight against central planning and socialist social control. Well, we have more choices. New consumerist orientation with satisfaction as a personal value accompanied the affective turn, and the old left labor feminists who didn't have time to ask themselves Betty Friedan's famous question, "Is this all there is?" were seen as out of touch with their feelings. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, was based on the fact that she was saying that all these suburban, overeducated moms of the 1950s were waking up one morning very unhappy, saying, "Is this all there is? My tennis dress, my husband going off to work in the fancy Buick, my beautiful children at private school." Friedan's feminists dismissed the political priorities and achievements of the labor movement because the labor feminists were not able to understand the new political, sexual, and therapeutic approaches to female freedom and liberation. The confrontation between the two tendencies in feminism was ugly. At a conference hosted by Wayne State University's Women's Studies Department in the famous year of 1970, that brought old and new left feminists together, sparks flew in a confrontation between Friedan and labor leader Myra Wolfgang. Myra Wolfgang was called the Battling Belle of Detroit. She was one of the most important leaders in organizing the service unions in the Midwest. Friedan called Wolfgang an Aunt Tom for her commitment to working with male-dominated unions and her alleged subservience to labor bosses. As a retort, Wolfgang condemned Friedan for caring not a whit for the needs of the majority of women, quote unquote. Friedan, of course, is known for her 1963 bestseller, The Feminine Mystique, credited with inspiring legions of discontented upper-middle-class suburban women to feminist awakenings. In her famous book, Friedan mentioned working-class women only as possible nannies or housekeepers that a wealthy woman could employ if she wanted to pursue a career. Courageously, however, Friedan deplored the 1950s cult of marriage. She painted vivid portraits of young wives and mothers, quote-unquote, matching slipcover material, making peanut butter sandwiches, and ashamed that they did not find this life of comfort, drudgery, and ease satisfying. Wolfgang was a lifelong union organizer and militant, known in her youth as the Battling Belle of Detroit. Wolfgang wore her hair carefully coiffed, and there were always large brooches adorning the lapels of her tailored suit jackets. So, the style is different. This is a new style. Wolfgang is like my grandmother, she had the helmet hair. And then suddenly it was like, woo, we don't have to do that anymore. These women are old-fashioned. Her first job was as a receptionist with Local 805, then known as the Detroit Waiters Union. And she took on leadership roles in hotel employees and restaurant employees union here, which still is one of the most powerful female-dominated unions in America, even in this time of union decline. She organized sit-down strikes when she was 23. She sent out racially segregated workforce crews from her union hiring halls against the wishes of racist employers. Historian Dorothy Sue Cobble called labor-oriented feminism social feminist. For the second-wave feminist who had flipped through too many women's magazines in her youth, the category of the social was too close to socialist for comfort. In the eyes of second-wavers, unions were male-dominated, old-fashioned organizations, too focused on labor rights and the need to expose and improve conditions in Marx's hidden abode of production. This is a really important phrase I want you to keep in mind from Capital, that exploitation takes place in the hidden abode of production, from Marx. Gendered violence had to take priority over exploitation at work, and it had to be exposed as the darkest secret of patriarchy's ubiquitous abuse of women. Political action for feminists would henceforth entail shining a light on the abuses taking place in the hidden abode of seduction. Friedan's aunt Tom Slur expressed the pure hostility of a new generation of feminists against working class women and their priorities, but it also implied that opponents of second wave feminism suffered from a form of psychological and sexual deviance. Women like Friedan wanted to compete with men in the professions. From Friedan's point of view, union women were masochistically complicit in their own oppression. Friedan and Wolfgang's confrontation would determine a sharp split in the women's movement. Labor feminists would go on to form the Coalition of Labor Union Women in 1974 to address issues of gender discrimination within unions and in the workplace. It drew on, by then, 3 decades of feminist labor militancy that grew in power in industrial and service sector unions since the 1940s. Dorothy Sue Cobble emphasized the fact that CLUE did not represent the expansion of the second wave of white-collar feminism into the labor movement, but it was the culmination of labor feminism's dreams for an institutional home that was sort of pan-labor union but focused on women. Myra Wolfgang became its first chair. According to Jefferson Cowie's history, CLUE was soon torn apart by the new left professional middle-class feminists, with their anti-bureaucratic, more culturally freewheeling ways and their conflicts with the collective bargaining commitments of old left leaders had come up in the labor movement. So the new left were very opposed to this sort of hidebound way of negotiation. They thought the labor unions were too bureaucratic, and the infighting between the old and new left did nothing more or less than alienate rank-and-file women who did not understand or care about the conflicts tearing apart the leadership. Friedan's side won all the battles and the wars. The suppression of working-class women's interests allowed feminism to move its power base firmly into the realm of the credentialed, the wealthy, and the powerful. 46 years after the Cobble-Friedan debate, when Hillary Clinton, the apotheosis of the PMC feminists, ran for president, powerful proxies for the Democratic favorite would insinuate that women who supported Bernie Sanders were sexually depraved gender traitors. See Madeleine Albright, Gloria Steinem, and Neera Tanden on female supporters of Bernie Sanders from 2016 to 2020. They were called Bernie Bros. I've been called a Bernie Bro. They were called women who were just there to get laid by men in the Bernie campaign. You remember all that. After Betty Friedan, there are a few second-wave feminists. Now I come to the trauma and the trauma part of things, and I don't have such great pictures for this, but there are a few second-wave feminists as important as psychiatrist and theorist of sexual violence and trauma, Judith Herman. Author of the best-selling Trauma and Recovery, The Aftermath of Violence, From Domestic Abuse to Political Terror, one of the most important and best-selling books on the politics of sexual violence, Judith Herman declared her work proudly a product of second-wave feminism. Situating the neglect of women in a patriarchal medical system, Herman focused on articulating new therapeutic approaches to helping female victims of sexual violence. By making common cause with anti-war activist Robert J. Lifton, she showed that post-traumatic stress disorder afflicted female victims of sexual violence in significant ways that demanded policy changes and medical and political attention. She brought discussion of sexual assault into public focus. More Freudian and less extreme in her pronouncements than Susan Brown Miller, Shulamith Firestone, or Catherine McKinnon, Herman was a Freudian who advocated the recognition of women's needs when it came to sexual victimization. Herman uses Brown Miller's definition of rape, however, as nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all, I want to emphasize that all men keep all women in a state of fear, to expand on and explain the particular nature of sexual violence. In Brown Miller's book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, class society exists only insofar as the, quote unquote lower classes form a quote unquote subculture of violence, where rape becomes a way of showing masculinity and toughness. I want to tell you guys, when I was in college, everyone read, classes read Susan Brown Miller, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. This book, it was highly lauded in the New York Times. It was, really, really praised. And this is how she talked about working class men. There were lower classes living in a subculture of violence. This was acceptable by the end of the 1970s into the 1980s. So in the opening pages of the book, Brown Miller singled out Marxists as being silent about rape. Silence is violent, hence the term silence is violent. I mean, it didn't come from that, but it could have. From her point of view, sexual reproduction itself was imposed on women by men because of male need for workers. These theories of sex and rape were hailed in the New York Times review as monumental and chilling. The personal was becoming increasingly political. Sex and political agency became the battlegrounds on which women fought for recognition of their particularity, of their experiences of victimization and marginalization. New generations of scholars would work to expand an understanding of sexual difference, sexual violence, gender-based inequality, and patriarchy. This was the founding of women's studies departments in the university was based on this. Trauma and recovery was a critical milestone in improving the treatment of victims of sexual violence. But its framing of trauma and its treatment of trauma left victims and the professionals who treated them in a political and social vacuum. The New York Times review of Trauma and Recovery hailed the book as a profoundly feminist work, which goes a long way toward restoring morality to a profession, psychiatry, that has often minimized male violence at home as mental illness, the normal female response to what, after all, are crimes against humanity, end quote. The reviewer also praised it as one of the most important psychiatric books to be published since Sigmund Freud. Trauma, before the work of Herman and her feminist colleagues, was gendered male. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was a diagnosis that focused on the symptoms of the largely male corpus of Vietnam War veterans. The medical establishment, when confronted with female victims of domestic abuse, found a way to minimize the responsibility of their male partners by diagnosing these women as suffering from masochistic personality disorders. This literally was in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, that these women had masochistic personality disorders. And in a way, this was an improvement, the psychiatrists thought, on the Freudian diagnosis of hysteria. Evidence of the deep sexism in the medical establishment and the psychiatric community was defined by Herman in a 1988 feminist study of emergency room practices in a large urban hospital where battered women were described as hysterics, masochistic females, hypochondriacs, or simply crocs. Herman found that doctors were skeptical and authoritarian with women who suffered the same avoidant, dissociative, numbing symptoms displayed by war veterans. Quote-unquote battered wife syndrome, like battered child syndrome, exonerated perpetrators, but worse yet, the former pathologized the victim. A wife was not a child. The gendered nature of victimization, from railway spine to shell shock, had not become apparent until the work of feminist doctors, psychiatrists, lawyers, and activists brought the specific forms of trauma experienced by women to light. Herman worked to expand the medical and legal definitions of trauma to include women who had survived the most horrific forms of sexual and domestic abuse. After the introduction of PTSD into the DSM-3 in 1980, veterans of the Vietnam War qualified for new benefits and treatments from the VA. Herman wanted the same recognition for female victims of sexual abuse. Female victims of rape should have access to the medical diagnosis and psychiatric treatment heretofore reserved primarily for male survivors of violence. Herman did the vital work of understanding the psychology of female victims and the transformation of their personalities under the stress of chronic trauma. Fighting against stigmatizing diagnostic mistakes, Herman found that the persistence of anxiety, phobia and panic and depression, a vulnerability to abusive partners and self-harm in survivors of chronic abuse could only adequately be addressed by a new term she coined called complex post-traumatic stress disorder, for which she provided a long list of symptoms. In expanding the definition of PTSD, Herman identified the shame and humiliation experienced by victims of rape as different steps in a trajectory of psychological disintegration that only proper diagnosis and treatment could address. So I want to, praise her for this very systematic first half of her book, in which she lays out the symptoms of female survivors of sexual violence. However, her own method engineered a different kind of depersonalization and decontextualization. In order to give substance to her theorization of recovery and healing, she cited acclaimed author Sylvia Fraser's extraordinary memoir, In My Father's House. It was a memoir. Fraser grew up in a blue-collar, working-class community in Ontario, Canada. Over lunch with her friends, when she was nearly 50 and a successful writer and journalist, she began to remember being sexually abused by her father, who worked for Canada Steel over the course of her childhood. Fraser, because of her gifts as a writer, was able to leave the blue-collar, church-going milieu to become one of Canada's most successful writers of her generation. Her account of her abuse is astonishing because she is unstinting about the complexity of her relationship to her father, her mother, and her sister, and the working-class world in which she grew up. Her father abused her over many years. He could, however, also be loving. Her disgust at his sexual assaults became somatized as seizures that sparked her mother's initial concern. Her mother tried to get her medical care. Fraser also describes herself as a beautiful child, an attractive and popular teenager. And she also does not exclude her father from some kind of praise and love. His good blue-collar job provided financial stability in their working-class town. She did not know economic want or deprivation, but she bore a burden of sexual knowledge and physical beauty and shame that her peers did not possess. She found sexual intimacy difficult. Men tried to love her. Her mother did love her. When Fraser suddenly remembered her father's sexual abuse, she told her mother, who was by then a widow. Her mother believed her daughter's story immediately and continued to love her without interruption. So her story is a complex narrative of feminist awakening as well as social, cultural, and economic mobility. She lives in Toronto when she remembers her sexual abuse. She had a rich and fulfilling life in Toronto, working as a journalist and earning kudos as a novelist and a founding member of the Writers' Union of Canada. Most survivors did not enjoy Fraser's unconditional maternal love and professional success. Herman writes, however, that, quote, Fraser typifies the experience of survivors. With her remarkable gifts, I'm still quoting Herman, she was able to reconstruct the story of a self formed under the burden of repeated, inescapable abuse, and to trace with clarity the pathways of development from victim to psychiatric patient, and from patient to survivor, end quote. So the inclusion of recovery in Herman's title was strategic. It's not just called trauma, it's called trauma and recovery. And there's something about Fraser being this award-winning novelist that offers like a template for women who are survivors of abuse, is that you survive the working class violence in your family, in your town, and you become a world-class writer. That's how you recover. Discussions of trauma must include recovery, and Herman ends her book with neat narrative case histories of recovery that fit perfectly within the narratives of the growing multi-billion-dollar self-help industry. It is in the second half of Trauma and Recovery that Herman offers the how-to formula for becoming a survivor. In a 2023 New York Times Magazine profile, journalist Ellen Berry described as radical at the time Herman's revelation that trauma could occur within the four walls of one's home. In this article, we learn that Herman's interviewees were mostly working-class women from the Boston suburb of Somerville. The specificity of their worlds or their family histories did not merit any commentary for Herman or her New York Times interviewer, but the survivors' recovery from trauma gives them special status in the eyes of the psychiatrist and the white-collar media professional. They are consecrated as survivors. So Herman's advocacy for a new understanding of survivorship and victimization neglected working-class culture and the meaning of pain and distress in working-class communities. If you all know Boston, Herman worked at Harvard, at the hospital at Harvard. If you all know Boston and Cambridge, that area, you take that, whatever they call it, the T, out of Cambridge, and you're immediately in this very, very, by now, deindustrializing, beaten down, working class suburbs, Somerville. There's, I probably encountered more racism there than I ever have in my life, but, it was like deeply homogenous, beaten down, working class community right next to Cambridge, one of the wealthiest, most liberal communities in America. And if she was to be doing research in the university where I'm from, the Institutional Research Board would have had all of these checks about the field of data collection that she was actually dealing with, which do not figure at all as a community. I'm not saying IRB is great, but I mean, there's no mention of where the women were coming from that she was doing her clinical work with. After the long theoretical exegesis of trauma in the first half of Trauma and Recovery, the script for recovery is astonishingly simple. There are 3 stages of recovery. 1, safety. 2, remembrance and mourning. And 3, reconnection. So working like a to-do list, the 3 stages of recovery represent standard operating procedure that mental health care professionals and their patient clients can follow. So in an era of austerity and mental health care rationing, it's great to have 3 stages because then you can check them off, really easily. United Healthcare will approve your services. The checklist is reassuring to a readership who are a combination of trauma victims, survivors, and the professionals who treat them. It is not only reminiscent of self-help and how-to manuals that enhance book sales and publishers' profit margins. Herman also modeled her recovery checklist on the DSM itself, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, which is all checklists. She admits that the trajectory to recovery is often oscillating and dialectical, but she offers a linear roadmap nevertheless. During the process of securing safety, she mentions in passing financial security as part of guaranteeing bodily protection and mobility. No more details are given as to how financial security can actually be achieved. In the name of safety as well, patients must be protected from their own psychic torment. So there are 2 forms of safety, financial safety and protecting a patient from their psychic torment. The psychic torment part gets a lot more attention. So to achieve this end, Herman says a recourse to drug regimes may be necessary, because if you're tormenting yourself, maybe a psychotropic will be necessary. So once the patient and the professional feel that stage 1, safety, has been secured, remembrance can then take place. And remembering is a form of reconstruction and testimony. Testimony is this word that's going to be so important for trauma studies, which is the second half of the book where the literature professors all go crazy and they don't go crazy, they kind of go crazy. And they use testimony as a mode of reading. So she says that, quote, the traumatic event challenges an ordinary person to become, this is in her words, a theologian, a philosopher, and a jurist. The survivor is called upon to articulate the values and beliefs she once held and that the trauma destroyed. She stands mute before the emptiness of evil, end quote. Despite all the dramatic language, note that theologian, philosopher, and jurist are all white-collar credentialed professions. And the pool of women she was treating were blue-collar women from Somerville. Recall that Herman's patients are mostly drawn from the working-class suburbs of Boston. In any case, it seems that survivors have to become knowledge workers and academics in order to give meaning to their suffering. This act of subjective reconstruction of past events then forms testimony which will allow for healing. The second thing that can happen with remembering, once you're safe, you can start remembering, is something called the flooding technique that Herman cites that allows therapist and patient to restore a survivor's sense of psychological continuity. Professional and patient prepare a script reconstructing the traumatic event. The patient recites out loud the script or the elements and events of the trauma to the professional after having done extensive relaxation exercises so that she can regain control of the flood of feelings. Herman cites VA psychiatrist Thomas Keene's finding that after flooding therapy, Vietnam veterans suffered fewer nightmares and episodes of hyperarousal, anxiety, and depression. Herman then goes on to compare the VA flooding technique with the work of a group of Chilean psychoanalysts, social workers, and psychologists who treated the victims of Augusto Pinochet's government. Ana Julia Cienfuegos and Cristina Minelli, the article's authors about Chilean flooding therapy, did this work at great personal cost during the military dictatorship. Augusto Pinochet's military killed and tortured tens of thousands of Chilean leftists who had been supporters of the ousted Salvador Allende government. The psychoanalysts used a tape recorder to record interviews with 39 survivors and the relatives of those who disappeared. They transcribed the sessions to produce texts of 15 to 120 pages. The text provided a detailed record of the survivors' experience of arrest, torture, failed, and mock execution. This was one of the torture things that Pinochet used, was that they would condemn you to death, take you out, and not shoot you. But it was just total humiliation. The final document, produced by psychoanalyst and survivor, was a written testimony of a political crime. Patients were urged to talk about their lives before their trauma in order to help restore them to a sense of themselves and their political commitments. Cienfuegos and Minelli are modest about the success of this technique. They say that the work diminishes the most acute symptoms of trauma, sleeplessness, anxiety, uncontrollable weeping, but the symptoms do not disappear. Cienfuegos and Minelli also focus on the psychology of the leftist victims of Pinochet's sadistic regime of torture and murder by documenting not only the trauma of extreme physical violation, 12 hours of electroshock therapy applied to the genitals, broken teeth, severed fingers, simulated execution, sleep deprivation, sexual violation with animals, etc., but also they really emphasize this in their clinical study, the trauma of leftist political defeat. This is a really important part of their clinical observations. Survivors' experiences were framed in terms of their loss of their sense of commitment, agency, and purpose that Allende's government had given them. Chilean mental health professionals who worked with Pinochet's victims were performing a political act. The testimonies they produced with their patients not only provided a cathartic shared event in which the crimes of the state could be articulated and controlled in a controlled environment, the testimonies also provided important research materials for historians of Pinochet's regime and eventual attempts to bring him and his henchmen to justice. Herman does not draw the connection between the American military and the Chilean victims. Since 1959, the U.S. Army's actions in Latin America entailed training far-right Latin American militias to defeat popular socialist and leftist movements. Guatemala came first, and then with their inability to intervene in the Cuban revolutions, U.S. policy in Latin America became more covert and more violent. The September 11, 1973 coup that brought Pinochet to power in Chile was firmly backed by the United States. In 2000, the CIA admitted to its support of Pinochet's sadistic rule. Perhaps Herman was unaware of this connection, since much of the major research resurfaced after 1992, the day of the publication of Trauma and Recovery. But an addendum could have been added to the 2015 edition of her bestseller. Herman does not mention why she does not mention why people would have been tortured in the 1970s in Chile. It was in an atmosphere of violence and state criminality that neoliberal economic policies, pioneered by the Chicago School of Economics, was imposed in this Latin American country. Cienfuegos and Minelli understood that psychic reintegration requires social and political contextualization. Without it, torture, decontextualized, becomes the stuff of fantasy and horror. Recovering is just as isolating as the traumatic experience itself and entails and requires a new kind of socialization. But for Herman, however, survivors had to be guided through a process of mourning before they could achieve personal, private, individual mourning before they could achieve the integration and psychological work of healing the self. She says, to find joy and be reintegrated into ordinary, everyday life, the survivor has to let go of her fixation on the trauma as the single most important event on her life. So in order to embark on the road to recovery, survivors of sexual violence have to give up on the search for a reason for their extreme suffering. One of the fixating questions is the haunting and futile one of why me that plagues victims of sexual violence, because it cannot be answered. For Herman, letting go of this question actually allows the healing to begin. In the case of Chile, however, for the survivors of Pinochet's torture dungeons, there is an answer to why me. They were victims of the military junta's terror campaign, and they were accused of being revolutionaries who defied the American empire. They had believed in building a strong, industrialized, socialist nation in Latin America, and Henry Kissinger and the Chicago Boys, along with Richard Nixon, could not allow this to happen. So there actually was an answer. American leaders supported what we would call today the extreme right in toppling a democratically elected leader and terrorizing his followers and the adherents of his revolutionary party. Although it seems that the aftermath of violence, of sexual violence and political violence can produce similar psychological wounding, it would be fair to say that domestic violence and political terror have vastly different social and political meanings. And I'm just going to end there because I could go on and allow Roger to ask me questions. Thank you very much.
I think we had a different chapter from the same work at Mason last year.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. I was...
They had me on Zoom at George Mason last year.
Well, we all anxiously await the finished product. I wanted to say that, like, your chapter that I read made me think a lot, and among other things, it made me think about the legacy of working class women who are often expunged from feminist traditions. And you bring us the name Myra Wolfgang that I might have come into contact with once or twice in the course of teaching courses on gender and sexuality but not more than a very scant mention. Or Susanna Wright, who was a working class heroine in
1830, but in another century, yes.
In another century, who suffered imprisonment because she advocated for suffrage and
universal suffrage for men. Because it was the early 1800s.
Yeah, it was the early 1800s. But yeah, so you like in this paper, you take us to a fork in the road, I think, and it's a strange fork in the road. It's a place and a time when modern feminism, the prevailing variant, might have taken different paths, I think, right? One based on the traditions of working class women's movements, social feminism as it was being called. The other essentially addressing the needs and goals of middle class women, the rising PMC that gets its first workout with politics in the 1960s.
Yeah, I guess I'll show this.
Oh, okay. Was there ever a chance that the modern movement could have taken a different path? I know I'm sort of asking you to do a counter-history or a counterfactual exploration. Was there ever a chance that did it develop differently in Europe, for instance, a bit, or was it predetermined to flow along the path that it took?
I would say like the McCarthy era, there were so many powerful women who are on the socialist side. Frances Perkins was labor secretary under FDR. And she's been completely written out of the history of both the labor movement and the feminist movement. And all of these women who were incredibly accomplished, not just Myra Wolfgang and Frances Perkins, but there were legions of them, whose names I don't remember now, they were all beaten down by McCarthyism. So it's amazing that Wolfgang survived that long and was working that long, because a lot of women were pushed out of their positions. They were tarred and feathered from 1953 onward. So there was the anti-feminist, anti-socialist movement, anti-communist movement of the 50s, and then you have the new left movement, which is the anti-working class movement. So you have, double forces making it impossible for the women's movement to have evolved along a stronger working class line. So I say no, but I say now, with the disarray of PMC feminists, although I think they're doubling down on their agendas, maybe there's an opening, because there's like bread and butter issues that ordinary women want and need, like parental leave. Those are no-brainers for an organized feminist movement to propose. Why is that not front and center at Planned Parenthood, at NOW? It's this legacy. It's this really intense legacy. And most of you know, I mean, I need to go dig this up again, but Gloria Steinem has been proven to be part of a CIA front to change the New Left. There was a biography that was going to come out 10 years ago documenting with FOIA about the money that was taken from the CIA. And she sued the publisher, and the publisher pulped the book. So, it's time to go back and look at that stuff and how the women's movement then focuses on representation in sex and competition with men, which was something that the social feminists were not concerned with necessarily. They believed that men and women were different. They could do different jobs, and women needed special provisions. The other thing that really killed the social feminists was that they were against the Equal Rights Amendment, because they were afraid that if the Equal Rights Amendments went forward, that women who are working in blue-collar jobs would have to do like really dangerous work that the men were doing, because they were equal. They wanted to be equal and different. So that was the nail in the coffin for them, because that's when the second wave feminists just completely said, you are all, left behind by history. You don't understand what's happening. What we need to do is compete with men. The Equal Rights Men provided equality at work. You don't understand this. And I was watching the Super Bowl, as many of you were as well, and they had that flag football ad where the women were like playing flag football, and they were like all running against the men. That's a perfect apotheosis of PMC feminism. Like, we're competing with men. We can run as fast as men. I'm going to tackle that guy. And that's the whole energy of this kind of PMC feminism, because I'm going to beat you at this game, and I'm getting a better job than you, Roger. That's the ethos.
It might be very interesting work to try to recuperate more of the alternative traditions of feminism, going back to the 20s and 30s, or even the 1830s, as you take us in this particular book. Not necessarily to model it exactly again, but to learn from the experience and then to try to map out where we would go from there. Another question, talking about Herman's work, you say, the definition of PTSD is a concept that continues to dilate almost to the point of meaninglessness. this constant dilation makes trauma a very effective political term. It's so squishy, it can be applied almost anywhere to anything and so on. A key word in the modern lexicon. Now, I mean, in Sex Panic and the Punitive State, I too sort of review what happens with concepts of trauma, especially in the 1980s, and how it gets untethered from usual understandings of trauma and applied loosely, and it becomes almost like an evangelical call. Yeah. You're invited, you, me, everyone is invited to introspect on their experiences, looking for sources of trauma, and then to sort of own that trauma, and then to reinvent an identity around it. So I'm a survivor now. I go forward, never. Funny thing is, if you're a survivor, you never let go of the trauma, really.
Right.
You're sort of forced to relive it over and over again, to retell it. It becomes your testimony.
Yeah.
And this is I've always been struck by the kind of empathy that's generated in this strange psychological action. Actually leads to cruelty and paranoia, which a phenomenon I gloss poisoned solidarity. Mm-hmm, and if there's anything from that book that gets circulated around, it's that concept of poisoned solidarity. So this is where the victims' rights movement comes into play, a diffuse but extremely successful social movement that reshaped normative approaches to criminal justice. You mentioned the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, which doesn't come up in your talk, I think, but is in the chapter.
Too long.
Which did a lot of good things, but was also part of the Omnibus Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which helped ramp up incarceration rates and punitive policies across America. Critics have called this overarching phenomenon something like carceral feminism.
Right.
Reactions, comments, suggestions. You must be treating this in another chapter.
What? Oh,
this question. I'm guessing.
You know what? I'm really trying to excavate the foundations and roots of present day political discourse. It's not prescriptive, but I want the younger people not to make the same mistakes that our generation made and the previous generations made. And one of the things that I think is a really important mobilizing critical theory concept that, cultural studies poo-pooed was reification. This form of empathy that is produced by trauma culture is totally reified, it's canned. It's a shortcut to feeling good about ourselves, and it doesn't really provide a solid basis for solidarity. It's a poison solidarity. And so I'm really trying to look at the roots of what creates this kind of crypto-religiosity within left liberal spheres. And some of you have followed the ridiculous discourse around Vivek Chibber's recent podcast criticizing woke. You'll see that this activation of any kind of blasphemy against this dogma is greeted with the most vicious form of attack by people who are allegedly tolerant and into centering marginalized voices, et cetera, et cetera. They cannot withstand critique. So I don't have prescriptive notions of where we go next, but I really want to urge all of us who believe that we're left or liberal, or even conservatives who might be sympathetic to this, to value the skills of argumentation and historical research and respect the goddamn past, instead of saying that that was the age of racists and we are the age of enlightenment. The struggle, the human struggle for dignity, for emancipation, for reason, for justice is something that did not start in 1994. or 2004, for you guys 2024, whatever, because you're so young. Have some respect for the past. Have some respect for the working class people of the past. Because if you want to talk about erasure, these were the people who were erased. These are the nameless people who built the industrial world that we know, which is fast moving towards post-industrialization. Everything takes place on the phone. It all seems frictionless. But so I don't have a prescription, Roger. I just feel like we need to respect the rules of the game, of reason, of our own professions more, because I see so many people in our profession just ready to throw babies out with bathwaters and purely emote. I've heard from my graduate students recently that in graduate seminars, people, if you take a Marxist line, people will yell at you until you stop. Like the yelling thing is a new thing. It's like we don't use reason, we just use emotion. And we will silence you with our emotions. And
I think we both agree that the left is not a healthy place to be at the present moment. It's full of rancor and recrimination, and it's probably only going to get worse as we go forward into this brave new world of the moment that we're going into. And it therefore becomes incumbent on us to investigate sources and origins and past formations. I learned a lot from your close reading of Herman's text on rape. I had glossed the book before, but I'm an anthropologist. We don't do close readings. we sort of use texts in a different way. But
I got a PhD in literature, so if there's one thing I can do, it's close read. Yeah.
But it was good to go through and review the origins and the sources and the frictions and what gets called in, what gets called out.
I mean, the whole thing about the Chilean episode is unbelievable. And
it is, yes.
So this is like the most important book since Freud, the New York Times bestseller. If you have a therapist, they probably have it on their bookshelf. Everyone reads it. And there's this section about Chile, and I'm like, no one's commented on this before? And what's really astonishing is, in the 1994 version, the conclusion is, let's all go into the former Yugoslavia and save the people from human rights violations. So she was doing the work of U.S. foreign policy at the end of the book, which in 2015 she admits she might have been wrong on, but she doesn't change the section on Chile.
You use the phrase trauma for export in the paper. It didn't show up in the talk, but I got access to the paper that you didn't read. But you use that.
You can buy the book next year.
You use that phrase trauma for export, and it sets bells off ringing because it seems to me that I want to express my agreement, right? I mean, trauma is one of those packages. It's part of a package of American concepts that gets fed into the transnational NGO circuits that are funded. The Clinton Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and other apparatuses like that in the United States, and it's become a powerful concept internationally.
Yeah, it's one of the tools of U.S. soft power. I mean, who knows? Trump, anti-trauma, he might be stopping that. But Ethan Waters' book about paradigms of mental health and U.S. foreign policy really has this interesting study about the Indonesian tsunami and flood, where 200 to 300,000 people died. In Indonesia. I think it was more than that, throughout Southeast Asia. But he said that what they found that when foreign aid workers came in with, trauma interventions and treatments, the survivors began to adopt the language of the American aid workers. But later, those communities did not show greater resilience than communities who had not gotten any kind of U.S. therapeutic intervention, who did not use the term trauma. They relied on more informal social ways of understanding the disaster, and that the people who had been treated by the foreign therapists, they were more reliant than on the external brought narratives that these foreign aid workers brought in. The other thing about the foreign aid workers was that they had trauma packages that various NGOs like Doctors Without Borders and a lot of global NGOs had provided. And what was in these packages? Well, a lot of feminine hygiene materials for women and a full array of like maybe 1 month's worth of Xanax or Prozac or anti-anxiety, So they were like seeding the need. They were creating the market for the psychotropics. So the other thing about the trauma for export idea, which is supposed to be, always argues that we have to get people on the ground right away. When a country goes through something as catastrophic as the tsunami, we have to get people right on the, right after the traumatic event so we can treat them. In 1992, and I don't even know if a study like this would even be possible now, The Lancet did a series of studies about Palestinian children who had survived the violence of the first Intifada. And they found that they did not react according to a trauma script because they had a narrative about violence and survivorship that has to do with the national mission. So the British psychiatrist who wrote this said, you know, when you have people who are socially reintegrated into a narrative where their trauma has meaning, or their suffering, let's not even call it trauma, their suffering has meaning, there's less of the kinds of PTSD symptoms like numbing, anxiety, phobia that we'll see. So the other thing, though, is that the self-help movement is going to take this and run with it, too, because if any of you are in childhood education, there's a huge term now that people want to use called resilience. Like, how do we create resilience? And that resilience is something that's going to be sold back to survivors. So it's all part of the script. Recovery becomes resilience, and yet there's this kind of political contextualization that I think is completely out of the picture when you have this highly commodified, highly reified way of talking about mental anguish. This is a thesis that I hope I build up to in the book, which is that the PMC gentrifies human suffering to make it trauma so that it can lay claim to a form of experience and monopolize the language around it.
I like the idea that suffering is distinct from trauma. Like, suffering is something that in Mexico, where I work,
that's right,
there's a very strong language
of suffering,
about suffering, how to incorporate it, how to live with it. You seldom get past it, actually, in a funny way, but to live with it and to make do with it. And this prayerful hope that it will be productive, that it will come to a good end. And that seems to me a very different experience. Maybe trauma is a key word of a certain lexicon. Recovery or resilience better would be another.
Which fits into the PMC idea of optimization, because if you're just suffering, you're not optimizing yourself. You know, Jennifer Silva's ethnography of Western Pennsylvania, where she's from, also finds that the working class understanding of pain in Western Pennsylvania, where she's from, is resonant with what you're talking about in terms of the suffering. There is the question of pain in Western Pennsylvania is very different from this question of relief that you immediately must get. If you're suffering, if you're in pain, Catholic, you have to find relief. So, I'm not recommending that kind of stoicism, but it's a way of giving a life meaning that lies out of the purview of the professional managerial class.
It's an alternative way, yeah. And stress might be another key word that I was thinking about as part of the coordinates here. I wanted to end with like you name dropped Trump a few minutes ago, and I want to end on a question that brings us up to that. So you say, I quote, "In the past 50 years, income disparities between men and women have improved, while inequality between the classes has only intensified. It is to the benefit of capitalists to manage disparity in the name of equity and to suppress class consciousness wherever possible. PMC feminists helped their cause. Herman and second wave feminists made history in their demands for recognition and their denunciations of patriarchy. They created a new culture around trauma and mental distress that was controlled by professionals. Trauma culture was an ideological tool designed to sideline working class militancy. They turned the political subject into an objectified personality, able to cite their lived experiences as evidence of standardized forms of survivorship. Then you draw out a picture of how the rising PMC served the interest of expanding financial capital, erasing conflict from the picture." So I come back, like, one of the things we do is in exercises like this is to ask, what time is it? Where are we? What are the coordinates of the present? And is this picture rapidly changing today?
Okay, so here's the thing.
Because I'm watching the headlines,
okay, so
and I'm watching PMC get purged by the bucket loads.
Okay, so so you know what? The denunciation and the rejection of the PMC didn't come from the left. It came from the right. And that animus,
it did, yes.
Yeah, and the hegemony of the liberal classes finally is being stymied by the right and even the far right. So
Yes.
all of those things that I've been writing about, hoping that we can find a left solution to the corruption of liberalism, is not coming to fruition because the right is doing it, the extreme right.
We're all
The center does not hold.
people like you and I are in a difficult position at this moment, as it were. We've been critical of identitarian politics, of DEI, of trauma culture, and so on for a number of years. And of course, now the temptation, I think, would be to they're being attacked by the bad guys, and now we have to, like, be quiet. So. That's the predicament, I think.
Right.
I see, if Twitter is any, or X is any manifestation, I see people that I know very well have opposed the PMC all of their lives, are now walking it back in the reaction to Vivek's podcast, for instance. I see people that I know agree with him, and they're falling all over themselves criticizing him.
Okay, so here's the thing that I think this form of American liberal hegemony has produced the rise of the far right in Europe. And so what we have now is, if you want to there's a kind of passivity among the center-left people because they think Trump is going to shoot himself in his feet. We don't have to do anything, and we'll just come back to power again.
You think?
I don't know. This is what they're not. There's no change. There's no movement. There's no self-criticism. There's no real. You know what they're saying?
I think they're paralyzed.
Ezra Klein is interviewing someone, Damien Auchincloss, who's saying, let's not go for economic populism. Let's just occupy the center, and the people will come back to us.
We almost won it. We got this close last time, right?
Yeah. So I don't. It is a difficult time, but I'm not ceding a single inch right now. I think we have to fight this, because you know what, the people have spoken. You know, there was a popular repudiation of an enormity that we have to take into account if we're true leftists. So a repudiation of these values. I think in some way that's why the PMC, like us, we're just followers. It's actually the working class that's the leader. And it might have been working class Latino men, for all we know, who are the leaders of a repudiation of this kind of politics. You know what? I'm saying this on on the record. Okay, fine. Let's just take
On the record.
questions.
Well, I want to say there's been a repudiation, but the managers of that repudiation have been on the far right.
Oh, they're not even managers. I think they're like prophets. It's just chaos. Chaos prophets. Prophets of chaos. Chaos prophets. Yeah, I don't know.
The chaos will continue, and this is probably why I think it's not coming back after 2 to 4 years. I don't think.
I don't think so either, but I think that's what the Ezra Kleins of the world are counting on.
I can't imagine it being true, but okay. And let's open this up for audience questions. I've gone on enough.
Yeah, yes.
Hi, thank you, Dr. This has been a great talk. I was struck by the way that you described this kind of like psychological language that the like second wave feminists used against the social feminists or the old left feminists, that they're masochistic or and I was struck that that's like a language that you hear a lot on the new left in the 70s. So someone like Mark Rudd is going to describe the PLP using similar and even much stronger language to kind of
What is the PLP?
the
Progressive Labor Party.
Progressive Labor Party
okay,
or Progressive
yeah.
Labor at the time.
Okay.
Like the kind of labor-oriented wing of the SDS.
Right.
And I feel like part of what was going on there was a sense that the old left, the more kind of labor-oriented left, had liquidated itself into the New Deal, FDR, the Fordist state, as they used to say, and that something had happened that couldn't be explained by like Pinochet's troops marching in and cracking heads, or even McCarthy, but that the left had kind of self-liquidated into the Democratic Party and into the FDR state. And that the only way you could make sense of what was going on was that these people are like literally crazy. They're like whacked out. They're masochistic. There's something wrong with these leftists because maybe going all the way back to like 1940, as Horkheimer put it in The Authoritarian State, that their will to freedom has been damaged, right? And so I'm wondering, do you think that there was a problem with the old left that kind of provoked this response on the new left? Like there was something there that had to be worked out? And if so, like, we can, like, you talk about, like, don't repeat the mistakes of the new left, but is there a mistake of the old left that also needs to avoid being repeated?
There's certain like old left leaders who are too identified with the bureaucratic hierarchy of the unions and everything else. I would just cite like Jefferson Cowie's history, The Last Days of the Working Class of 1970s, where he said there were obviously problems with the blue collar unions. They were sexist, they were racist, but in the United Mine Workers Union, there was a young union leader who had been elected who represented this new left spirit, and he was assassinated by order of the old unions. So there were historical struggles within unions themselves that were not allowed to take place because the labor movement was, destroyed both by the new left and by rising austerity, by stagflation by 1972. So, yes, there were definitely problems within the formation of within the union formations, and even today, I would say right now, like today's union organizers are more and more taken over by white collar types. So there was a suspicion about hierarchy and compromise, right, that the new left had with the old left unions. Hoffa went to the White House. There were fights that needed to be had that were completely squelched by the tax on labor and from the right from the economic powers, Volcker to Nixon, and by the new left. So it's difficult to say. It's difficult to say how those errors might have been corrected had there been a real airing out of a truly democratic rank and file possibility within the unions. Yes, there were but the mistake for me is that there should have been more struggle, more open and honest struggle, rather than the dismissal of people as just left behind and, I'm going to use the R word, retarded. And they were just, and they had to be disposed of because we were moving forward as a vanguard group. Do you see what I mean? That's, to me, the error. Of course, there are mistakes that are being made politically all the time. But how do we, how do we just dispose of the past and the struggles of the past and imagine ourselves to be, just the vanguard of the future and everyone has to follow? To me, that is the fundamental mistake. There was more wildcat strikes in the early 70s than there had been ever in the history of the labor movement. What happened, though, was that the U.S. began deindustrializing in '72. So it collapsed itself. So that's my kind of inadequate answer. But what goes wrong in political struggle should be the recognition of who our true enemies are. They are not other union leaders. They truly are the capitalists. Vivek Shibber is not the enemy. I am not the enemy. Elon Musk is the enemy. But if you're a member of the left and you think I am your enemy, you are crazy. Oh, sorry. You are wrong. You're wrong. You're just wrong.
Civil debate is the way to go on this.
I'm not a big into civility, but yes, reasoned debate.
Thank you for your talk. I think it's important, but trauma narratives don't have undue weight in our discourse, but also, only ones that are the correct narratives, I guess. But I wanted to ask you, you ended your talk with the sentence that domestic violence is not political in the same way as this very specific thing that happened.
No. It has different social context. Domestic violence versus political terror. Right.
That's what I want to ask you about on what level you understand that, right? Because on a statistical level, the answer to why me when it comes to domestic violence does have an answer. And I see especially because the capitalist class, it's very convenient for them. So on social media, I'm seeing all these narratives of men are the oppressive class. There's this South Korean movement to basically stop dating men, stop having sex with men. And so I'm just basically seeing the rise of, sort of patriarchy as the dominant form of class.
Form of oppression.
Right, sorry, yeah. And so the liberal feminist response to this is Barbie. You can use your sexual power to be a girl boss and, dominate. But the conservative response is, so I read Project 2025's definition of feminism recently, and it relied on this theory of sexual difference that was, we need to protect women. And it was kind of taking that women shouldn't do dangerous jobs thing from the old left a little bit farther and saying, well, society doesn't respect mothers anymore, all that. And so I guess my question to you is is there a way to understand sexual violence in a way that's maybe sort of going beyond this crude sexual difference, men are the oppressor class, or also beyond the literal feminism or conservative feminism?
I want to go back to this question of why me. You said that there was an answer to that? I think when you really suffer a blow of fate, that question has no answer. And to fixate on that is to ask for an explanation and to remain attached to a fantasy that if you had the answer to why me, you would be better. And I do think that there is no answer to why me in the case of sexual violence. And in fact, I think that helps women not feel like they were responsible for being victims. For saying, oh, I was wearing the wrong thing. I was wearing a miniskirt. There is the why me thing is a terrible, terrible thing to fixate on when you suffered a blow of fate. And I do think Herman is right to say that you have to let go of the why me. But I'm just saying she makes the survivor of sexual violence the equivalent to the survivor of political terror. And there is an answer to why me there. So I want to be really clear on that. I feel like this, the present state of things, actually this paper, the slides from this paper that I'm showing are from a paper that I gave on the gender problem. This was a paper I gave a year ago about the ideology gap between men and women. So it's like there's a reified liberal conservative gap now that's growing. This was from 2024, before this election even, and the election has shown this gap to be even greater. So there were originally, and I think that it's a response to this idea that men are just bad. Like when I said all men are bad, if the liberals are telling you that all men are bad, why as a man would you vote for them? Why would you feel like you needed to participate in their politics? And yes, that kind of feminism is coming up in places like South Korea, which is very patriarchal and Confucian. But to make the enemy men and not capitalism seems to me a terrible, terrible mistake on the part of the left. For Project 2025 and this whole notion of courtliness, I think that they are able to exploit the crisis of gender difference and the sexual relation. Like, what is the role of a man? If in liberalism you have this idea that they're just bad, they're the worst, they are your enemy. I think that that's why that kind of essentializing feminism really does the work of disguising the power of capital. And so this gender divide, which was drawn out in the FT in February 2024, is playing itself out in electoral politics today. And what a sad, sad, stupid mistake to make men the enemy.
I guess my question is, how do you understand sexual violence politically then? Are there alternative solidaristic narratives that can happen without gender as part of the calculus?
How do I understand you know what? There have been studies that have shown that portable health care and good social services allows working class women to leave bad relationships. So that if you want to create a strong social democratic state with good child care, the other thing, they had an experiment in France where they opened up 24-hour nurseries in working class neighborhoods where there was a preponderance of sexual violence. And oftentimes it would happen at night after both parents came home from work, right? Because you have two families working. When you have a 24-hour nursery where things get really tense and you can put your child somewhere and resolve an issue or leave each other or separate for 24 hours even, the rate of sexual violence goes down. So if you really care about sexual violence, instead of creating more laws to punish people who are, in these domestic spheres, in these domestic intense situations, then we should strengthen social services. And if you really care about the family, then we should strengthen social services, strengthen a social democratic state. And maybe that's pro-natalist. Maybe that sounds like it's conservative. I don't think so. But I mean, the whole idea of PMC feminism right now is so far from that. So what do you do if you're just aware of violence all the time against women? You don't have a program beyond that. But you can raise a lot of money if you have an NGO, or you could before Trump, but yeah, so there's another question in the back. Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So my question might be a relatively simple one that was kind of alluded to earlier, but we talked a lot about solidarity and being self-critical. So in your view, how can the left be self-critical without appearing at face value to kind of perform an act of betrayal, especially when the right is kind of verbalizing a lot of the same arguments. How do you balance that without fracturing solidarity?
You're saying that was a simple question? There is no solidarity right now on the left, so I don't know how my critique of its past is fracturing it. There's no solidarity. I feel like the solidarity that we have, Roger and I have been part of an insistent class-first part of the left, and we have a very tight, sense of loyalty. But the sort of wider academic left, would see us as class traitors. But I think that insisting upon reasoned argument, good research, rationality, and really achieved empathy is one thing that we can do to promote authentic relations. I'm going to sound like a total romantic here, but I think there's a lot of inauthenticity on the left. There's a lot of lip service. You know what? You're like the 20, 30 somethings, I just see you all talking to each other. It's like this. Yeah, man. Wow, cool. Yeah. Yeah. How can we have better disagreements? There's no trust. But we need to be able to have more robust disagreements to overcome our errors. But if everyone's just pretending to agree with each other all the time, we're going nowhere. And that's not solidarity, that's fake. Or it's some kind of weird etiquette.
Not to put you too much on the spot on that, but I was wondering if you, as a professor, as a teacher, if you have any strategies about combating that in your classroom.
You mean this assent?
Yeah, how do you stoke dissent or stop the head nodding? Do you have strategies that you like to deploy
I like
as a
the
teacher?
head nodding when I'm teaching. No, I try to. I don't know about with graduate students right now. It's a very, very hard time. But with undergraduates, I just present theories and facts, and I try to foment historical understanding. So I'm teaching a course on romantic comedy now, and the history of it is so fascinating. So rather than being dismissive of history and saying everything before 2000 was racist and sexist, I try to look at the narratives of romantic comedy as narratives that try to achieve equality between the sexes, between lovers. And love is this magical thing that can produce equality. I think that we have to return to some kind of basics. And it's very hard to do because among graduate students and in the sort of conference level thing where higher tier professionals, everyone's looking for novelty. So it's the Anthropocene, object-oriented, whatever. I don't know what else. I must be behind because I'm not really. What is necropolitics, biopolitics? Everyone says a lot of. They say a lot of watchwords, and then everyone's yeah. And when I encounter this, of course, this does produce some kind of rejection and resistance. I'm well, what do you mean by that? Or do you think death didn't exist before this time? Or I prod with historical materialist questions and model good research. Because one of the other things that I think I try to criticize in Virtue Hoarders is our classes' renunciation of professional standards itself. So in the socialist utopia, we would all be intellectuals, but we don't even know how to be intellectuals now within all of these professional settings. So fostering dissent means creating trust. And I think there's so little trust right now, especially in graduate school. Undergraduates are much more open-minded, but there's so much mutual suspicion and competition in graduate school, competition for novelty, that, in some ways, those are the classroom, the graduate classroom is one of the most repressive and tense places right now. I don't know about Georgetown, but where I'm from, yeah.
I really enjoyed the comparison between sexual, physical violence and the political terror. And I'm just curious about the recovery from trauma, especially in the PMC environment, because I've been an adjunct teacher for 13 years. And if you're demoralized about your career path, that's really bad also. But most PMC environments, I would guess, are a lot like grad school.
Yep.
Basically extended.
Yep.
And so would this kind of atomization and this aloneness and the self-censoring and the kind of crackdown authoritarianism, maybe I'm mixing things up, but is there an element of trauma there? And I think if there is, it's going to be very collective, and I think eventually that's going to be reified, very slowly. Not enough to keep up with capitalism, but it will be reified.
It
but
is
is there a pathway? I mean, is there anything practical in
organizing? Yeah, out of that kind of collective sense of exploitation. So I don't have a direct answer to this, but one of the things that trauma studies doesn't talk about is the trauma of wage labor. The fact that you have to sell your time to actually be able to feed yourself, to have a house over your head, and to alienate yourself at work. That's one thing they don't talk about in any of the trauma studies book. It's always these spectacular human rights violations, very in line with American foreign policy. But I hope that this book clears the deck a little bit so that we can talk about the universal experience of exploitation and the universal de-skilling and degradation of labor processes, not just through AI, but through managerialism. And what has happened within this white-collar environment is this intensification of competition for prestige, for jobs, for things that don't have, that are in short supply. And I think that those are objectively extremely traumatizing experiences for people who have come into this profession or people come into academia thinking this is a place where I can freely explore ideas, where I can debate things, especially if your parents were not part of this class. Then you come in and the betrayal of the ideals that you said, I could have gone to work for Cisco Systems, and I didn't. I gave up. I went to graduate school, and then 10 years later, you're realizing that all your friends have trust funds and there are no jobs. There's been a betrayal of the intelligentsia, that's figured in all of this. Whether or not that consciousness can lead to some kind of revolution, I'm not sure about. But we have to see ourselves, and this was part of Richard Horder's too, first as workers, second as experts, and not as second as gatekeepers. What are the labor conditions of a thinker right now? They're terrible. How is that related to the labor conditions of other people? In the book, I open with the first real use of trauma as a medical legal category, which has to do with railway spine. There was damage to your spinal cord that certain doctors and neurosurgeons of the late 19th century in England had identified, so that these business people who are riding on trains could sue railways for liability. So that is actually the first use of trauma, is for upper middle class bourgeois people to sue to make railroads liable. Now, I don't love the idea of prosecuting labor on the liability issue, but I do think the way that the universities have been managed makes them liable for a lot of the suffering and the affliction of people who were aspiring to enter into the professions. It's not my favorite way of thinking about this thing, but how can workers use this against the large organizations? The caveat about the 19th century is industrial work was not seen as traumatizing. It was the railway accident that produced the first use of trauma as a category of liability. Like worker injury was something else. It was called injury, not trauma. So not a great answer, but I do think, and this goes back to the Frankfurt School, is that we live in a damaged world, and it is thought is deeply, deeply damaged by this damaged world.
With this idea of the trauma of selling your time, of being for wages, or maybe this is an obvious, I guess one could disagree, but when one has gone through an incredible human rights violation, incredible natural disaster, the thing that trauma studies often focuses on,
Yeah.
I don't think many people would disagree that that is worse in some way at least, or at least more difficult, at least more direct.
Yeah.
Trauma causing. We can talk about language there, but I think you see what I'm trying to say here. How do you make sure that when you're talking about the trauma, or whatever term we'll wind up using, of selling your time, you're still approaching it in a way that respects the different type of trauma that one might experience with one singular devastating event?
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think it's necessarily worse. Okay. I think that if you come from a very wealthy family and you go through a terrible traumatic event, there's a lot of social support for you, like just a healthy family, or even if you have good relationships or robust social ties. I think that, and it's very individual. So we're looking at it's apples and oranges here. We're looking at these singular, individual, absolutely devastating events, right? And then with wage labor, we're looking at a process of taking the best times of your lives, of taking your potential for thinking, for creating, for nourishing people. And we're saying, you give that best time of your life to Ford, to Cisco, to Sodexo. And if you have no skills, we pay you so little that you worry about putting food on your table or buying insulin. The scale of that is very different from the scale of a singular event that afflicts, even the tsunami, the Indonesian tsunami, affected millions of people. But what we're talking about with industrial exploitation is the systematic, historical stripping away of people's capacity for agency since the invention of industrial capitalism. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not one is worse or better. It's two massively different types of experiences. The fact that we think trauma can be fungible is one of the problems with trauma culture. So when I talk about work and wage work, I don't want to talk about it necessarily as traumatic. I want to talk about it as damaging, as exploitative, as a ground of universal experience that might make us more associated with others. One of the terrible things about trauma as an experience is it's extraordinarily isolating, right? But is there a way in which the suffering of the wage labor can be the grounds of association? And this was one of the greatest things about Marx's theorization of solidarity, is there's an impersonal sense of community with the person who's on your assembly line. And that kind of community was a secular one. It's not before God that we're all together. It's because we're all enslaved in the same way to the machine. So I urge you to think of yourselves as members of a human community of workers whose struggles for freedom have provided, and whose work has provided with you with electricity, with running water, with the conditions of a kind of intellectual flourishing that should be the inheritance of all human beings. So I think we'll end it there, right?